Okay, so welcome to our meetup. It's our first meetup, JSHeroes Meetup in 2021. We wanted to say hi to you in this new year, and we're curious to see what things you guys think they're gonna go big or they're gonna disappear in 2021. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna go around the room, and if or you have any questions, we're gonna write them down in the chat so everybody can see them, and then we can go and discuss around the topic. So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna start from the beginning, and if you don't have any questions, just say no, and it's not an issue, or you can add a question a bit later. It's not a problem. So, Laurent, do you have any questions? You can tell it to me, or you can write it in the chat. What topic you would be interested in discussing in this meetup?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I have any preferences. Mostly I'm interested in server-side rendering, basically. I think that's it. If there will be some other topics or some things that will come up in the discussion, I will ask them.
Please forgive me if I don't write it well.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yes.
Okay, so I wrote it there. So we talk about server-side rendering. Okay, thank you. Christina, what do you want us to talk, or what topics would you be interesting for you?
Well, I'm interested in what do you expect from the job market? First of all. Second, I would like to know what are your pains as JavaScript developers regarding your day-to-day responsibilities. Where do you see the market going, the whole JavaScript ecosystem? And that's about it, I think, for now.
Thank you. Okay, Evalika, do you have anything that you would like us to touch in this meetup?
I hope there will be more people, but I was hoping to hear more than to talk. I'm interested in, I don't know, new things on the CSS side and front-end framework, so things like this.
Front-end frameworks, and sorry, I didn't catch the first one.
The CSS. Oh, yes, CSS. That's how you say it in English, right? CSS.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I usually say so that's why I was. Why didn't I understand? But yes, it's CSS. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so Florine, what do you want us to talk?
Hey, so I would be really interested in your thoughts about what's going to happen with WebAssembly and how is that going to affect our, let's say, next 5 years as developers, regarding speed, regarding bringing bigger applications to the web environment. And what do you feel about TypeScript? Will it become the norm or not? That's it.
Okay. Robert?
Florin covered my question, like how do you see the front-end market, like the TypeScript, where do you think it's gonna go front-end with TypeScript? Is gonna be the new norm, or?
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. If anyway, if you guys have any questions later, we can touch them then as well. Okay, Stefano, do you have any questions or things that you would like us to talk in this meetup? You can unmute yourself, or if you want, you can write it there. Okay, perfect. If you have any questions later, you can just type them in the chat. Thank you. Vlad, Pascari, do you have any questions? You can also unmute, or you can write them in the chat. It's up to you. Okay, you can just unmute yourself, and if you want.
Yeah, sorry. I have a question. So I didn't manage to enable disable mic. So no question, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Vlad Zelinsky.
Well, I think a couple of questions have already been touched. Maybe it would be interesting to also touch a little bit on the build tools and the build side of things, which could be interesting, right? Because a couple of things changed lately based on popular surveys that circulate around the world, especially in terms of popularity. The testing space as well, maybe that would be something that we could also touch upon.
Testing, unit testing, automation, or
no, testing as in frameworks, right? And frameworks, and what are we missing as developers there? What are people using? Why are they using certain things? How does it help them to do their day-to-day job? And I guess one thing would be also interesting to maybe, tying back into the entire market and everything. Maybe it would be interesting to discuss a little bit the idea of what does it mean now to be, as a JavaScript developer, what are you expected to focus on? Because there are so many things nowadays, right? There's this notion of full stack as well.
Yeah.
I got a couple of these ideas from Alex's presentation on a Web Odyssey, and he talked a little bit about how the entire market is going to change in terms of more segregation and responsibility in the coding space, right? So you're not going to be necessarily a full stack developer doing all kinds of JavaScript, CSS, HTML things, or that's actually the question. Are you going to continue to be or not throughout 2021 and furthermore? So maybe that would be also interesting to discuss, in my opinion.
Yep, that's a really good question. And I think it's one of the pain points that most of us have, that, at least sometimes that's how I feel it. Okay, so back to me. Did I miss somebody? Stefan, do you have any questions? You can write them directly in the chat if you want, or you can unmute yourself. Okay, so I have a couple of questions as well. Some of them, they are touched, like the one with TypeScript, for example. But I'm also curious if, for example, also it was touched a bit with the frameworks as well. I'm curious, for example, I haven't heard, at least in my group, for example, people using Angular. I mean, a lot of people go towards React. TypeScript maybe it's Angular. I don't know what's the right naming. I haven't seen, for example, any new projects with Angular, so that's why maybe it's just my the context that I'm working in. And I'm also curious, and probably Christina can help us there. What skills do you see they're needed for a JavaScript developer in 2021 on the job market? Okay. Anybody else has any other questions? Laurent, we went around the room and we put some questions down. If you wanna add a question, what you would like to us to discuss in this meetup, just unmute yourself, and or you can write in the chat your question or topic that you want to discuss.
Yes, of course. So my question will be if TypeScript is going to be default way of starting a project, something that will that the project will require by default. This is something I would be interested in.
Well, thank you. I think it was added. TypeScript is the norm, so I think it fits in that category. So yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I think a lot of us are curious about this. What I just remembered now that maybe what frameworks should we have a look on the server side of like Node.js? Okay, so server-side rendering in 2021. Anybody wants to start? What is your opinion on this topic? Okay, I can say at least a few words on this. At least my colleagues, I know they use Next.js to do this to fix this issue, because you can or at least on React projects you could do the server-side rendering and do the setup yourself. But with Next you have some advantages and you could do that quite easily. So I don't know if that helps the question. For somebody who doesn't know what server-side rendering is, server-side rendering is sorry, is building your HTML and JavaScript part and CSS on the server and save it and serve it on the front end as a HTML page. And after it's loaded, you can then do the JavaScript part. This helps a lot for the search engines, and it's usually a bit faster to build. Because, for example, search engines like Google go on your page, and if they read the HTML part with all the information there, with all the DOM built already, it's easier for them to parse it and index it.
Also, most robots cannot render JavaScript. So Google's robots has some capabilities, or at least they advertised it as having the capabilities, but the other ones do not. My I have mostly two questions about this. This is why I brought this topic up. So how efficient is because I've only messed around with Next.js. I did a proof of concept in case it was wanted on a project, but in actual production environment, how efficient is the way Next handles these operations? Because it gets the HTML from the server, but it also downloads the component structure on top of it to be able to start rendering, at least in React. That's how it does it, and I'm not sure, that doesn't sound very efficient. And the second question would be, how isn't there a bottleneck in communication with APIs? For example, if I have three APIs that on the front end could be called in parallel, but they are used on the server side part before the HTML is built, isn't that a bottleneck for until it gets served to the browser?
I can, yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a lot of experience with Next. I just played around. Actually, JavaScript JSHeroes website, it's done with Next, but it's not complicated. So, Vlad, if you know more, just go ahead and please.
Right. So there are a couple of things that I would like to touch regarding the questions that were asked, and the things that were mentioned before. Now, before we get into the server side thing, I just want to mention that not only it was advertised, but also in the way it works, Google's crawlers, they actually work very well with JavaScript, right? That does not mean you're gonna get, like visibility all over, but it's not as big as a concern from a SEO perspective than it was like 10 years ago. That's just one point I wanted to make. Now regarding the server side things, I'm not gonna talk about Next.js specifically because I also don't have that much experience, but I've done a couple of things with server-side rendering based on React's capabilities, with streaming HTML back. And there are two things that I want to say. One, in regards to the question about the APIs, right? That's actually not going to happen on the server side. So you're going to do a couple of things. You're going to render some HTML onto the server side, and then you're going to stream that HTML back. So you're going to render it from React components. You're going to stream it back to the client side, where you're going to do this process called rehydration. Also in terms of state, right? Because you got to synchronize the state that you have on the client side from the entire application. Maybe you even have a state management tool like Redux or Modex or whatever. You got to synchronize it with what it has been done on the server. And then everything that's JavaScript specific there is going to be called, the JavaScript needs to be interpreted and parsed and interpreted client side, rehydrate the application, and then you're going to have all of those calls being done and stuff like that. So what you're actually going to pay is a subsequent amount of time in terms of the time it takes to parse the JavaScript on the client side and rehydrate it. And this comes in opposition with the fact that you're going to get initial, usually faster rendering times because you created the main HTML on the server side and just stream back HTML per se, which is way slimmer in terms of the payload and way slimmer in terms of the the overall time it takes to send those bytes in and then render them on the client side, because it's just going to be HTML that you put CSS on top of afterwards. So I'm going to touch back on this idea of APIs and how can they be localized only on the server side, because I would like to briefly talk about this new concept in React that's been in the open for a very short time. But basically, you can't really segregate the JavaScript responsibilities that also imply API calls from the client side. You can't segregate that from the server side, and cannot easily port them, at least not in the current state of React specifically. The second thing that I wanted to mention in regards to the performance, there's no short answer to this, and you got to measure stuff, right? So it's a trade-off that you do between an initial faster, usually faster render time, and the fact that you got to rehydrate on the client side and make sure you synchronize states on the client side application with what you had on the server. And the way you do that is by paying a cost in terms of time that comes from parsing and interpreting that JavaScript, including the rehydration code, and you pay that in order to get those faster initial times. And I think the answer to this is to just try it out and measure it, because I've heard a lot of success stories with doing this on the server side and getting out an initial HTML that comes to the client very, very, very quick, and it gets rendered quickly. And especially if you combine that with code splitting on the client side in terms of JavaScript, you only rehydrate a portion of the app that contains the state that you're currently viewing, and you do all of the background work for synchronizing the entire state or just parsing the code of other JavaScript components. You do that by lazy loading them. So I've heard a lot of success stories with doing this, but I've also heard stories of not that great success, or let's call it small failures. For example, in the case of Pinterest, right, where they tried this approach on the server side, and they realized that with proper code splitting, the cost that they were paying upfront to render on the server side and create all of that HTML, plus the payload of that initial HTML and the time it took to send it over the wire, was greater than the time of properly, and plus rehydrating the app was greater than the time of just sending the initial HTML very, very slim and creating with JavaScript, with a small portion of JavaScript that was lazy loaded, right? Code splitted and lazy loaded, only that initial part of the app that the user was seeing at that moment. So they actually tried to server side render stuff, but they got into this point that by measuring, they were actually obtaining longer times with doing this than they would have obtained in the normal mode of just, properly code splitting and lazy loading JavaScript on the client side and just sending blank HTMLs and let the JavaScript do the rest. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I've heard way more successful stories than stories of, like failure trying this, but I still think it needs to be tested on a case-by-case basis.
Awesome, thanks. I definitely agree about the performance part. There is never a clear-cut answer to any performance questions. I'm just a bit surprised how popular it is right now. Having this approach of having some APIs which are mostly just a layer over the database and doing server-side rendering via JavaScript frameworks. I mean, I've read about projects and approaches like this. I've been reading about them for months now, and people are very excited about this. But it just seems like there's lots of accidental complexity here, which I know that the the tools themselves probably mitigate a lot because with good documentation and good setup and good scaffolding of a project, things can be done easier. But I'm just a bit surprised, that's all. And with also given that you need to still rehydrate everything.
Yeah,
doesn't seem very efficient, especially in low latency networks. I think people are working a lot with very, very fast networks, and I'm not sure this would be feasible.
Right. So that's true, right? In the sense that we tend to be very biased when we do development as people working on code, as developers per se. We tend to be very biased into and practical about the conditions that we have at the moment X in time. Which is, if you look at Romania per se, just as an example, we're actually doing pretty good in terms of bandwidth and network connectivity and how fast it is and stuff like that. What the whole idea of server-side rendering was to help with that initial render, right? And that initial render can actually go a very long way in terms of perceived performance. It's not like you're going to overall be a whole lot better if you server-side render, but it helps a little bit with that initial hit in the sense that you are able to show the user something. Like, for example, a page that gets rendered in terms of HTML and CSS, with the JavaScript functionality rehydrating in the background and all the events listeners and all the things, etc., being added after you get that initial view. And sometimes this can go a long way in terms of how the user perceives the performance of your website, because even though overall you're going to get the same time to interactive, or roughly the same time to interactive, you're going to get faster initial rendering times, which are going to make users say, well, right, this site renders faster because I've seen a page doing something or showing me something after just 1.5 seconds instead of just waiting for 7 seconds to see anything, right? Staring for 7 seconds at a blank screen.
Or seeing loaders everywhere.
We're seeing loaders and exactly all kinds of user patterns that show you that something's happening in the background. But so again, it's mostly centered around this idea of initial rendering times, which is just a part of the overall, the overall things and the overall process that you need to complete until a user can properly interact with your website. And what that point in time actually means is it's calculated based on this metric, which is called time to interactive. So that's the time at which a user can properly interact with your application by clicking buttons and actually, doing stuff in the background through those actions. So it only addresses a small part of this issue. And the second part that I was mentioning was that it's very hard to segregate what is functionality in terms of data fetching and attaching event listeners on components and stuff like that, because you cannot do that on the server, right? You just render HTML through server-side stuff, and then all of that HTML gets enhanced with future capabilities like adding event listeners and rehydrating the state on the client side with JavaScript. And also you need to send back the components, and the client side code is gonna refetch or fetch data at that point in, I don't know, use effect or component mount or whatever people are using nowadays, specifically in the React ecosystem. So the client code needs to get parsed, rehydrated, and then executed. And then, you might have run trips back to the server, issuing data requests and stuff like that to further populate your application. So in this regard, I have some good news. I don't know if you were watching closely the React ecosystem lately, but roughly at the end of December or something like that, there's been a post from the React team with something that they're working on at this point called React Server Components. So I'm actually gonna take a brief moment to paste this in the web in the chat. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that link and watch the presentation. It's from Dan Abramov and another person whose name I cannot recall right now. But the whole idea of this is that instead of sending pages per se to the server to be rendered on the server, pages which can be actually, you know, formed out of multiple components that need to just render on the server from an HTML mostly perspective, and then have all the feedback of attaching event listeners and doing the data fetching on the client side, you are able to send in components that are rendered on the server, including the data fetching part, right? So you would have a component that would render on the server, including the data fetching part, that would allow you to go on the server to the database, which is going to be very fast because you're not going to pay the time it takes to send that request over the network from the client to the actual server, right? So it's going to be very fast. It's going to happen in the server's memory, and you're going to only have the connection to the database. And then you can take that data and bake it into the component. And the most interesting thing, but I also find it funny, I don't know why, but the most interesting thing about this is that you can actually have server components that are going to render on the server, which are going to then be streamed back to the client to have client components, which are going to be 100% rendered on the client with JavaScript interpreted and parsed on the client, which can in turn have server components as children, which are going to render back on the server side, right? So it's a back and forth thing that now happens at the component level, including the data fetching things, right? And it allows for a much proper segregation of responsibilities. Because think about this, I think we've all come across this pattern of smart and dumb components, right? Or you create, or how's it called? Presentational components and what's the other name? Container components, right? Where container components create and contain the logic of data fetching and then pass it down to a child component, which only acts as a presentation layer. So in a component, you just do all the data fetching that you have, and then you take all that data and you pass it down as props to a children component, which only accepts props and renders them on the client side. So if you think about a system that has multiple of these patterns, you can now simply deconstruct them and say that the container components are going to be server rendered components, because you're going to be able to render them on the server, including the data fetching part. You're going to get to the data very, very fast because it's all going to happen in memory on the server side. You're going to take all that data in and you're going to stream it back to a client component, which just acts as the presentation layer. And then that client component can deeper down into the hierarchy contain another server component that just does the data fetching, including other child components that will act as client components later on, only for presentational side of things. And it allows for a much cleaner pattern, a much cleaner segregation of responsibility or separation of responsibility for that matter, if we're talking about coding principles. And it also allows for faster build times on the server, right? And if you combine all of these with code splitting and lazy loading, you're going to be able to achieve overall way bigger performances that are going to be consistent also in times of time to interactive, not only in times of first initial render. So I hope that makes a bit of sense, what I just said.
It does.
But
It
I
does.
highly recommend reading the article and just watching the presentation, because it's a good run through, and you can actually play with that, I think, at this point. I don't know if it's experimental or not, or if it's just baked in and you can try it tomorrow. What I also know is that the next version of Next.js is supposed to support these by default, which is also quite a good news in my opinion. So yeah, that's what I had in mind.
Sounds good, but this obviously assumes that you have JavaScript on the server, and it connects to the database. So it's basically your server-side language.
Yeah, that's the thing. You gotta have, like Node.js.
The entire stack should be.
Yes, as a server-side language. In terms of database connection, I think at a certain point, all servers connect to the database. And if they don't, basically, you're not gonna need that in your application by default anyway. So it wouldn't be a problem in terms of, like payloads and network requests and anything at that point. But yeah, that's why Next.js, I think, is gonna, they're the first ones to jump on this train, because their entire stack and everything will allow them to do this very easily.
Awesome.
So I haven't really read, sorry, I just joined this conversation, and I'm not familiar with these React server components, but from what I've heard, don't they sound a lot like having React with Apollo GraphQL? How is it different? Because you can have components that issue their own queries. They can be rendered on the server. And I'm not sure, when you say that the server renders these components, will it stream back HTML or data, or what would it stream back to the client?
I think it's also gonna stream back HTML, right? It's gonna stream back HTML, but with React components in it. So it's gonna stream back, I think it would be like some sort of JSX, which is then gonna get reinterpreted on the client side with the client components as well. This is something that I don't have a definitive answer to. That's just a guess that I ventured to make. So I'm not very
it's no problem
oriented
no problem.
in this regard.
Right.
But in terms of Apollo and GraphQL, right, you still issues requests from the client to the GraphQL server, which then goes back into, like through resolvers and everything goes back to through your server and onto the database in the end. But you still pay the payload of issuing the requests from the client side, and they have to travel the network. In this case, it wouldn't be, so those requests would happen on the server side.
But when you say server render component, you mean on the initial load or on the initial page load? So that means they would be static for the rest of the run? Because maybe I misunderstood.
They would be static for the rest of the run, but they would be, it's not just about the initial load, right? You can actually imagine this. You have a page, you have a parent component that you render on the server side, and then you have 3 children component in a hierarchy. So I'm talking about everything in a parent-child relationship, right? No siblings, no anything. You first render that initial component on the server side, it streams back JSX. All of the children component from level 2, level 3, level 4, they get rendered on the client side. And level 4 component, which is a client-side component, contains another server-side component in it as a children, and that gets rendered back on the server side. And if you do this with lazy loading and code splitting, you can actually achieve not only the initial render of the page, but subsequent renders of that initial page or part of those on the server side by going back and forth between the client and the server, depending on how you construct your hierarchy between server-side components and client-side components. And that's actually decently powerful if you code split and lazy load them, right? And if you combine that with the fact that you can render on the server those components which are dealing with the data fetching to win the payload that you pay to do the network requests, right? You can construct the hierarchy of your components in such a way that all of the, or mostly all of the queries are going to happen on the server, and your client just receives components that are going to be rendered as presentation and interpreted and parsed, interpreted and rendered by the React on the client side. So it's like, it's a little bit, in terms of approach, is a little bit of going back to those days where everything was rendered on the server and the client was just receiving the HTML, and you would sprinkle JavaScript on top of it, just in terms of interactions and event listeners and stuff like that. But you now do it on a component basis, not on a page basis, like it was before. That's how I see it in terms of approach, architectural approach and mindset. I hope that makes sense a little bit, or at least a little bit.
Thank you, Vlad. I think we should go to the next topics. I mean, maybe we could have just a meetup about server-side rendering and React server components, if you guys don't mind. So I would like to tackle the next question, which is, what do you expect from the job market in 2021? Christina, if you want to give more details, like what to expect, do you mean like skills required, or what part do you want to touch there?
Indeed, I'm interested in what skills do you see that are required to be a JavaScript developer, a good JavaScript developer? If you haven't seen a change during this month regarding how your responsibilities look like, do you see that if you're open for a job, do you see that the jobs ad have other things, other tools, other frameworks are more oriented? I'm interested on that.
Yeah, I think this touches a bit with what skills should a JavaScript developer have in 2021 to be relevant to the job market. I think they're tied up a bit.
Yeah, but I'm interested to get the information from you guys, not as me as a recruiter, because I already see some changes, but I'm interested, how do you feel or see?
Anybody wants to start? Okay, I can say a few words for the beginning until somebody else wants to jump in. The thing is, what I see with the job market is that they're expecting, I think Vlad mentioned a bit that part where you need to have like a tons of skills, and a lot of ads requires tons of skills. So if you're a JavaScript developer, part, for example, of the, let's say, of the jobs description contain also, you need to know some DevOps stuff like AWS or any other stuff. So the thing is, I think this trend, unfortunately, will go on, and I would have preferred a bit to remain a bit more like focused on some of the things, because now I think they're expecting a JavaScript developer to do everything, and I think it's good for the employer because they don't need to hire more people to do those specific job, but it's really hard for us, and on the long run, I think it's not good for the employer as well.
Right. My 2 cents on this is that I believe that the market is going through a transition period, in the sense that I do agree with the fact that this is still something that's not going to shake off in the following years, but I don't think it's sustainable over a longer period of time, because everything in the ecosystem is just rising. Tools are getting better, smarter, but also new tools appear. Frameworks are getting better, smarter, but new frameworks appear, and so on and so forth. And sorry about that. But the user expectations also get bigger and bigger over time. So I don't think this is sustainable for a very longer period of time. I think people have a limit to how much they can keep into their minds in terms of knowledge and everything. It's like you have limited brain space for that. The companies are going to realize that, and at a certain point, they're going to have to make a better segregation in terms of skills. Now, at that point, I think we're going to get into some sort of financial wars, because there are going to be differences in terms of utility and in regarding what you can actually do, and whether or not the fact that you can code in JavaScript is more or less important or more important than coding just CSS, which is going to be more important than coding just HTML and so on and so forth. But I think that's going to happen in a not this year, but in a distant future. It is going to happen because you cannot keep up with that.
I'm not mainly a JavaScript developer, so I can maybe come with an even broader view from what happens, from what I've observed in other technologies as well. I think the basic programming skill or skill level has decreased. I think there's not enough focus on that, and there's too much focus on other stuff. Like it was said before, DevOps skills, maybe to know lots of tools, lots of technologies. In the end, these tools and technologies usually have good documentation. Some of these tools are very idiot-proof as well, at least when it comes to setting up and just get going. When it comes to the advanced parts, you usually need someone who actually knows what they are talking about and has dug into the code. This is the first. So basic programming knowledge is missing, I think, and maybe that should be that should be a bigger expectation than all the rest of the tools. We are very I mean, the JavaScript community is very proud of switching to functional programming, but I haven't seen proper functional practices applied on projects. So, and there are also stuff like Angular. It will probably come up later, which is purely O. So it's a bit strange that there is no solid programming skill needed, or there is no background for this. At least companies are not asking for it. And the second part, I know we are tracking forwards with the technology and we like the shiny new stuff, but because these frameworks abstract away most of the heavy lifting, people tend to not know how HTTP works, how basic web processes work, and maybe you will have to integrate some legacy script for tracking script for a client, and you will have to know basic JavaScript for that. It's not enough to just write some components and that's it. I have experienced this in my teams, and especially when I've talked to junior developers and I've talked with other people from other companies as well. These two things are lacking, and they should be focused on more, in my opinion.
Hi. Actually, yeah, Daniel, you want to go to the next question? Oh, sorry.
It's no problem. We can go to the next one. It's fine.
I mean, you can say it's not an issue. We can just say your thoughts
I completely agree with what was just said. I feel exactly the same, and I come from, you know, I've been working for a long time. I remember the first requirements were for you to translate the design into a pixel perfect thingy. You had to know a lot of CSS, cross-browser issues. Those all went away, but the market became more fragmented. Nowadays, it's all about frameworks and this and that, but it's never about the basics, I think. We think of someone as being a senior if they know the basics. They think of themselves as seniors if they know very well React, for example. But as soon as we introduce, like you said, HTTP or caching or query strings or whatever, some simple basic things, they get lost and they get. It's sad from my point of view as well that this is the situation. But on the other hand, I think it's the market that generated this, because we didn't work on too many apps or websites that required people to know the complexity of their algorithms. We have the network latency to blame when something is slow, or we introduce pagination and that's it. You only load 10 items. So you don't really care about how fast or optimum your code is. And I think this is the cause of all the bad code we see today.
Can I play a little bit the devil's advocate here, or
yeah,
do we?
Sure.
I don't know. No, I'm looking at Daniel because I don't want to.
Yeah, just go a couple of minutes and then we
okay, I promise.
I think we touched a bit also what are your pains, the next question also with all this talk. So go ahead, please.
Right. So I want to say one thing, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. As a developer, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I've chatted with a lot of people, and I do think you're both right. And this is the overall sentiment I get from the market as well. But here's a harsh truth about what we're doing. We're actually being judged on output, and output means products, and products mean things that produce money for our clients. And the thing that is a fundamental relationship, or a fundamental truth in this relationship, is that the money and the outcome is not 100% and always tied in a correlation, in a pixel perfect linear correlation with what we're doing as developers in terms of the code. And I know that sounds a little bit harsh and undesired, but that's the reality. So there's another point I want to make here. And I don't think this is for 2021, not even maybe this decade, but as we go on and on and on, technology evolves. And what we need to do as programmers and as people, not only as programmers, as people in the society, but especially as programmers, is we need to move up the abstraction ladder. And we're going to work with more and more abstract things down to the point where we're going to actually be allowed to forget how something works internally down to the very core level. And that's going to be fine, because people nowadays working in Java, which has memory management done by themselves, they don't know, or most people doing that, they don't really know how to memory manage everything, as opposed to people working in C, for example, where you have to memory manage everything by yourself.
I tend to disagree with this. In C, you have to do it from the beginning. In Java, you know from the beginning that there's the garbage collector, and not knowing the essential leads to bad code, which leads to bad maintainability, which means to people getting angry at their own framework and dropping it for the next big thing, creating unhappiness amongst developers that they still have to do, for example, let's say Angular 1, which was fine and everyone was hyped about at that time, but they all dropped it. And now give someone a project with React using classes and they will be really, really angry. Is it your fault? Did you write that code? No, they did it. But now they don't like it because there's a shiny new thing and they don't want, they just want to drop whatever they've been doing so far and jump to the next thing. I think this is bad.
Yeah. So
I think
I'm not.
maintainability is the key word that I think it's relevant in this discussion.
Right, but that also doesn't go on for ages. So what I'm saying is not.
Well, you know, some projects will disagree with you.
Right, but no. We can talk about decades, but what I'm saying is not that legacy code doesn't exist, and not that there's always going to be a market for older code and people needing to understand the basics in order to be able to properly work on that code. What I'm saying is that on an average, on a decently long time, we're going to move up the abstraction ladder, and I can see why in 20 years from now everybody's going to know how to program React, but they don't know how HTTP works, because all of that is going to be baked into protocols and everything, and in the framework layer, and everything is going to be done by itself, the same way memory management is now being done by itself, as opposed to how it was 40 or 50 years ago. So
Right.
And it's normal for that to happen.
Just
it's
one
just
more
a
thing.
consequence of technology. That's what I had in mind.
I think you're right, and that's good. But I think the bad thing about this is that everyone is moving with the proprietary framework and not with the open web. I think web components is the way to go, and not virtual DOM, which is more about developer experience and not user experience. If you think about all the computations and the battery life and everything that involves, right, to run React on the client and computing all those diffs and whatever it does, I think it's sad that people don't move with the browsers and all the diffing and all the events they support by default. That's the wrong approach from my point of view. So going with these frameworks, consider how different Angular is from Vue and from React. And like everyone solves the same problem in different ways instead of adopting an open standard that works for everyone, and we wouldn't be so divided as a community.
Yeah, I think we can pass to the front-end frameworks that you just touched them somehow with your comment. How do you guys see the war between the front-end frameworks, and where do you see the winners in 2021?
I personally don't see a winner. I think there is going to be a slow movement towards web components because all the big companies are doing it. There's a nice talk about it with some of the people behind this and how they sort of went quiet a bit from the social media because of all the toxic fanboys-like mentality and all the comments that they had. I think Salesforce is one of the biggest companies that implemented a lot of components using web components. And there's just a lot of benefit. There's going to be support soon for server-side rendering these web components. There is no way of declaring the shadow DOM right now, but it's coming. Anyway, I think heading towards components is the way to go. So I'm using lit element. I really like that framework.
Can you post a link in the chat?
Yes.
With it, so we can have a look on it. I can give my at least how I see the front end frameworks. And as I wrote one of the question, that is Angular dying, at least in the context that I'm working and the colleagues and the people that I talked with, I see Vue and React as the winners and the main drivers, at least probably in 2021. I rarely heard like any new projects starting with Angular, for example, or even Svelte, that it was quite popular at the beginning of 2020. Like people were talking a lot about it. What do you guys think?
Our vaccination platform is Angular from what I've seen in the DOM. So I think if there is This will probably happen in companies where they have specific departments for a specific stack, and where there's lots of .NET, you will find Angular as well. Just because the ecosystem is like that. Angular was the first framework that adopted TypeScript, and TypeScript comes as a typing system based on C# as Microsoft developed. So because of this, the tooling and IDEs and all that we need in our daily lives, I think is what influenced this. And that's why I think we have .NET people, or .NET on server and Angular on the front projects. These are actually very common. Well, I don't think it died or anything. It's just
I'm not saying it's died, but
I know,
it faded
but
away because
yeah.
it brings some good benefits, Angular. I'm not saying it, but I just at least in my context, that's why I was curious how you guys see this.
This will probably vary a lot from company to company, but even from country to country. Similarly, you have specific PHP frameworks by country, or specific Go flavors, or Python divided in countries as well, depending on the project. So companies will specialize on some things and not others, because that's the technical portfolio they've built up.
But a big factor, I think it's also the fact that there's mostly outsourcing going on here. So if you'd have your product, you could choose something that fits your product. But if you outsource, you basically have to just match what the client needs or what they tell you to use. Anyway, I agree with you that Angular and React, and I think Vue is coming up really strong these days. They're really good to have in your tool belt. I think it's easy to get a job if you know one of these. But I wonder for how long this will last.
Okay.
Well, React is pretty often in the news cycle, I think. So they will keep themselves up there for sure. If they come with server components, and if they keep coming with new things and new approaches, if people are finding something that's novel and the setup is good and the perceived performance is good enough, then they will adopt it.
I don't question this. I just feel like React is doing a lot more than it should be
okay,
on the client. Like if you want some optimized code and you care about, like I said, the battery of your device and so on, you might opt for something else.
Cool, thank you. We're gonna go to the next question. CSS.
Is that the question?
Yeah, I just wrote front-end frameworks and CSS, and I think if I ask this question, so anybody has something to add at this, like what we're gonna use for CSS in 2021? Or do you guys see any trends there? I saw like, I haven't used it, but I saw like Tailwind. Is that like a framework for CSS or something? I don't remember. I haven't read about it.
It is.
That it grew quite a lot.
Yeah, I can post a really nice video with Tailwind if you want. But I'm not Personally, I'm not a big fan of it, but I think it's really good for prototyping.
Okay, perfect. So if you can write it in the comments, it would be really helpful.
In our project today, we parked ourselves on Material UI, and it's just too easy. So we are not going to switch anytime soon, I think.
So I'm in charge of an internal project, as I'm sure happens everywhere in Cluj, at least. You get a bunch of newcomers and you give them an internal project where you can experiment with things. One of these things was the material design guidelines, so no framework, just reading their specs and trying to implement some of the things described in there, because there's a lot, from accessibility, from animation, you know, all the spacing, fonts, all of it to be taken into account, and how to think in terms of units, atoms, molecules, interactions, sheets, elevation, all of those things. But I think this is the kind of effort you put when you care about the product and you own it and you have all the time you need. Other than that, I think you're just going to pick a framework or a convention like BEM or whatever else is there, and you're just going to go with that. I don't see people excited about CSS whenever we're holding interviews. I think 90% of them don't want to touch CSS for some reason. And it's all about React nowadays and writing components, but not the CSS for it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is WebAssembly and how is it going to affect us in the next 5 years?
I think that this is aimed at companies who have big products that they want to bring to the web, or new devices that can be integrated with the web. But other than that, I don't see an overlap between what we do and the WebAssembly.
Okay, anyone else?
Maybe tooling could be based on it. As the complexity grows and we try to integrate with lots of different lots of different tools that are not in the JavaScript ecosystem, and they are into, for example, I think the SAS preprocessor has some WebAssembly in it when it downloads and after which it builds. So things like this, which if you would run these tools in, if you would interpret JavaScript code, it would be a lot slower. But when you actually recompile them and make a very, very optimized code, then that will speed up some of the at least installing, or at least initial bootstrapping, or of whatever mechanism that you want. But it's something that I see rarely. So yeah, not sure if it's very web specific.
Okay,
unless you get a project where you have to write a game.
But even so.
Yeah. You have Unity for that.
it's a very niche technology, and I don't think it's for websites. It's for complex apps like CAD level or Photoshop level, even though they can be done with proper JS, I guess, most of it, but heavy computations and stuff that we really don't ever touch as in our day-to-day lives. I don't think it's for web developers.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can move to the next topic, which was the TypeScript, if it's a norm, and if I know any project started in 2021 should start with TypeScript. What do you guys think?
Everything should have TypeScript. I would make it mandatory.
I think if the project is small enough, go with JavaScript. TypeScript just slows you down.
But I'm interested, why would you make it mandatory? What's the reasoning behind?
I'm curious too.
Sorry?
Why would you make TypeScript mandatory?
Oh, I think it just offers a safety that doesn't come with JavaScript.
Sure, that's on paper, but have you encountered those problems it solves?
Yeah, for sure.
I haven't.
For sure. I mean, not personally in what I've coded, because we write tests as well, and so that kind of solves it. But I've been involved in the effort of training front-end developers, even though I was not a front-end developer, and that was hard because basically I had to convert teams that have been doing only styling until then to start working on products, and it was a very painful journey. And in judging on that experience alone, writing JavaScript, switching from JavaScript to TypeScript actually reduced time spent on bugs, reduced the number of bugs, because, and this is because I've been working with juniors or mid-level colleagues. It was still every dumb mistake was eliminated, and that just that is a big plus. And when it, I mean, we in the meantime we've switched to functional programming, but when I tried to introduce object-oriented programming and some elements maybe of rich class design, rich object design, and stuff like this, that eventually would lead to TDD and domain-driven stuff. When you don't have to write tests that verify the return type of something, that's a big help already.
I understand.
There are lots of stuff. It's just safety, and it's very convenient as well.
Well, my experience is the exact opposite. I think it slows you down a lot and it doesn't allow you to iterate. I agree, you should write that if you start and finish a polished product, yeah, why not? But if you throw ideas, you show the client, they change their mind, you change your code, I think that most of the product development time, at least that I'm doing, is putting ideas into code, showing them to the client. They decide if they like it or not. We redo everything. Of course, there's going to be bugs, but the bugs are related to the business logic or are unhandled edge cases or some errors, not the types, not anything that the TypeScript could solve. And it slows us down if we have to define all the types and interfaces. What I end up doing is just playing around with the code, throwing it in the face of, at the client.
Mm-hmm.
They see it, we iterate, and we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
All the backend or all the interactions are very well documented. It's really, and we have good naming conventions. I think it's really hard, or you have to do it intentionally to have mistakes in there, or maybe a search and replace gone wrong, but those are not the issues. Mostly it's race conditions or business logic that
I think it also helps in business logic a lot. If you are try to stick to the notion of having your code reflect the business requirements, at least when it comes to the types and the interaction between these types, I think it's helpful. If you have some business entities that you and some interactions between them that you have to model, if those happen in the front end, then it's pretty good to have TypeScript and have the types describe what the actual business is there. It adds a bit to the readability, in my opinion. But it shouldn't slow you. I'm not sure how it slows you down. I mean, if you don't want to fix typing issues, you can just put any and you solve the issue. Unless,
right, but what's the point of using it then? Right?
No, the point is then you can, if you want a period in your project where you want more frequent iterations, then you can have that, and then over time build the type system in to solidify.
Well, I've been using GraphQL, and GraphQL has the schema which validates all of our business related models, and
okay, then
that works really well.
I'm actually gonna, in terms of opinion, I'm gonna play the middle guy between you guys. So, and this is my take on TypeScript. First of all, I'm actually not a big fan of it. I don't use it, so that full disclosure, I don't use it, and I have what I believe are reasons for that. But one thing I grant TypeScript with is the ability of it as a technology, as a superset of types around JavaScript, of acting as a level playing equalizer between various seniority levels within the team, right? So I believe it's decently good to use something like this whenever you have a big team where the level of seniority is quite mixed. Like you have very junior people, but you also have advanced people with a higher level of seniority, and they all work on the same code base, and there needs to be some sort of a like a checking system that allows for the code to be decent, maintainable, easily understood, and that can kind of like prune away all of the inconsistencies that may arise, especially from coding at lower levels of seniority. Now, that being said, I believe that a lot of things can be covered, a lot of things that TypeScript offers in terms of these checks, a lot of that safety net, let's call it like that, a lot of that safety net can be covered by doing other things that actually should be done anyway in a decent project. Like you do unit tests, you have linting, and you have a couple of checks in terms of static type static type checking of your code when you actually coding or pushing to a branch or whatever. So you should have those tools enabled on your client side, like ESLint or I don't know. And another thing is a function of knowledge. So what I'm saying is I've rarely seen people who have a decent knowledge of JavaScript jumping into the TypeScript bandwagon, because they just know enough that they know enough that they also know the inconsistencies and possible dangers of coding in JavaScript, and they know how to avoid that, right? So I personally haven't used, I mean, I've used TypeScript up to a certain degree, but after a certain point, I think if your team has a decent level of seniority, I believe the cost of adding this new technology and learning it and maintaining it and writing types and interfaces and make sure that everything is decently on track and maintained, and just not putting any everywhere, because then you're just using it for nothing. I believe that cost, depending on the team composition and what you have to do, and whether or not it's a project that you just want to prototype, or it's something that's going to grow into this giant over 3 years that we have to maintain. And looking at all of these factors, I think there are some use cases where you could jump into the TypeScript bandwagon, and some of them where you don't. But I personally haven't used it consistently since it appeared. I play with it. I know the things that TypeScript does, but I choose not to use it because I think that I can get by faster just by knowing the things that I know.
Okay, I think. Oh, I have one more question about this topic with TypeScript. I'm curious how you guys see, for example, an internship starting directly with TypeScript or with JavaScript. Because I think, at least how I see it from the exterior, I think if somebody's in the beginning and they start learning, it's easier to learn JavaScript than TypeScript. I think it's a little bit more confusing.
It could be. Depends on the actual pool of candidates that you have. Right now, nowadays, or maybe even from forever, especially the web part was very, very permissive in terms of what's the actual computer science background. Lots of these technologies are very, very easy to get into. So you have lots of self-taught people who just don't have the CS major background. But if you have a pool that do, then that pool of people at some point learned about typing systems and learned about Liskov substitution, contravariance, covariance, things like that. Even if they maybe forgot or they weren't at that particular course that semester, they should at least be aware of the terms. And I think in that case, starting up with TypeScript would have no overhead at all. But if you have people who say that, okay, I've done some websites and I've done some HTML and I have a React project and I've did a to-do app with a server on some, I don't know, AWS or something, then maybe yes, JavaScript would be, but I would gradually roll them into it. So even if you don't have to know generics, you don't have to know, it's simple enough to say, okay, just make sure this is an object, this has these properties, even if you, they don't have to know the setup of it. They just have to know that, and the IDEs help a lot. So, well, I understand the point of being confusing for sure.
Okay, thank you. We passed our time by 5 minutes. We can, if you guys want, we can continue and try to stay just a couple of minutes to the topics that we have, or we can close it here. What do you guys think?
I think we can go on some more I'm okay.
Okay, so we talked about TypeScript. Let's talk a bit about the build tools in 2021. Anybody has any opinions on this, or what do you guys use?
Do you guys use Rollup?
No.
Because that is like the hot thing nowadays. It has basically the same feature set as Webpack from what I've read, but I haven't seen anyone actually switching.
Took me ages to learn Webpack, and I need a reason to switch to something else.
I totally understand.
Right. The reason, and this is something that I'm pointing now to the state of JS, results from 2020, and I think that's a decent metric considering it's a global survey and it touches on so many countries, and a lot of people respond. There's an interesting trend there in the sense that Webpack seems to lose a little bit of the popularity because of the proliferation of other tools, Rollup being one of them, but not at this point, not that popular, which abstract away even more of the configuration work that you need to do, right? Because that's something that kind of like hinders people. Like, okay, Webpack is used in a lot of places, but it's so convoluted in terms of the configuration and all of these options that you have, and you have to specify and you have to configure it in a certain way in order for it to do whatever you want it to do. So I think there's a trend in the sense that people are going to look for ways that they can put in as less brain power as they need to achieve decently similar results, and tools that are going to abstract away the configuration, like Rollup being one of them, or ESBuild or Snowpack, which are quite recent entries in the 2020 survey. They're gonna, or Parcel, for example, they're gonna be there to kind of like support this trend. That's my thought on it.
Well,
I also think that frameworks are helping on this side. To be honest, a few years back, I was like, oh, Webpack, I could do that. I would do the setup for React, and I would do a lot of twitching there. And I was like looking at people, oh, you start with React, create app. Oh, I was like, no, you have to have your own Webpack. But now, to be honest, I don't even care about Webpack. I just want my project to start and to work. If there are any issues that I want to do, I'm going to dig in. But as Vlad said, I want it to be as easy as possible. And if a few years back, for example, at the interview, I would ask people if they know Rollup, Webpack, or anything else, I would do it. But now it's not even on my radar. I think these things should be abstracted for us and use the brain power, like Vlad said, to do something else. At least that's my feeling.
I agree, but I remember how scary it was when we first used React scripts or whatever they were called, and we had no idea what to do, and how confusing it all seemed, and how to add something new to it. Anyway, for me as well, the entire build tools fell under the radar. Don't care about them, mostly because browsers nowadays do most of the things that you needed polyfills for or other hacks. But there's like, I don't know how many of you work with mono repos and like more complex projects. I think that's the only time where I do care about the build tools.
For sure. And having and when it comes to a team managing their own CI pipelines, for example, then there it counts as well, because you have to optimize those. And when you want to have the test coverage and things like this, so this is not the cases in which we need in-depth webpack knowledge or even custom builds, custom configurations, are not for business reasons. These are mostly for our sanity when it comes to CIs, when it comes to reporting, when it comes to things that are actually, that maybe the team lead or the architect is supposed to deliver to stakeholders. But the rest is mostly just optimization of local dev environments and fast pipelines.
Cool. So I think we can go to the next topic, which is testing frameworks. What do we use? What are we missing? Anything on those lines?
Cypress is great.
At least for automation tests, my colleagues use Test Cafe, and they're quite happy with it. We use it for the for the past 3 years or so, at least, maybe even more, and everything goes well. For the like unit testing, at least my default stuff is Jest. I go to Jest and then see what other tools I need on a side for what I need to test.
We sometimes combine with Xenon if we need some more complicated mocking and stubbing. But usually there are enough plugins for Jest and enough plugins for Cypress to help us go along.
And probably the main question is who's doing tests. I mean,
yeah.
At least I can say we're doing some tests, but not as much as we need. Or at least we're at the beginning of the project and things move so fast that what I implemented today, I might scratch it tomorrow. So when we get a bit more stable on the project, at least we're gonna start adding more tests. We just created a few tests, for example, for React, for the stable components that we know we're gonna have for a while. And on the backend side, I just used a couple of tests, unit tests, and then we're gonna probably do integration tests, either with Postman done by our automation team, or I'm gonna do with Jest and Super Agent and do the calls and stuff.
We are trying to have as many tests as possible, but this is project specific. Not everybody writes the same amount of tests as we do on our project. We actually need those tests, so it's not like we are aiming for 90% because we were told to. We actually found it useful to have high test coverage, and we are trying to switch to test-driven development, and it encourages thinking, basically. Thinking first and then writing the code. we are finally, and fortunately, we are in a position where we can dictate the quality, and we can have actual serious discussions with the stakeholders about this, and they understand, which is very rare in my experience. So we can actually say that we can afford having these conversations and doing this stuff. But I know for sure that not everybody is in the same situation. So
Thank you. The other topics, I think we touched them a bit, like what should the JavaScript developer do? Angular is dying. What are the skills should the JavaScript developer have in 2021 to be relevant to the job market? The only thing that maybe we didn't touch is what frameworks do you guys think are going to be popular on the nodes, on the server side, like the Node.js? I noticed that, for example, Nest.js, it's growing quite big. Are there other competitors or any other frameworks that we should keep an eye on 2021?
what are the main features of such a framework? Why would Nest.js be a choice over, I don't know, something else? I have no experience in this. I am working on different technologies on the backend, so no Node.js experience here.
At least what I noticed is that on the server side, on the front end, we have the frameworks, we have React, we have Angular, we have Vue, and we have some, let's say, best practices and the way of doing stuff. But my feeling was that on the server side, on the Node.js, people were going like in different ways, doing implementation by the year, or how they actually want it. And I think that was one of the things that is missing on the Node side of the server side, is like a framework to have a standard of doing stuff. And I think that's why Nest, I haven't used it. I just saw it a couple of times. Somebody just grabbed me, hey, look at this framework. It's new and it's on JavaScript. And I think it adds some consistency, especially if you have a big project and people are coming in, you have a structure and a thing to relate to. At least that those ones are the advantages that I see.
Is it different, like from using something like Express, for example?
No, it's like a full-blown, if I remember well, it's a full-blown with let's say models, controllers. It allows you to interact to the database. It creates the models and all that part.
So a full stack framework for everything.
Yeah. It's not like just but Express
router, just a router, and that's it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think we can wrap things up. Thank you very much for coming and for staying a bit longer, and thank you guys for listening us, and thank you for contributing to our meetup. Okay,
thank you. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.
Great, thank you.
Take care, guys.
Have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye bye.